Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings and this is going to be the third of a four-part series on the basics of music notation. In the previous videos we covered what the staff is and how to draw note heads on the lines and spaces and how to extend the staff. We also talked about where to place notes on a staff to indicate the pitches that you want. We talked about where middle C is on a piano and how that relates to lines and spaces of the staff so you can properly place the notation on the staff in a way that will have the performers perform the appropriate pitches for you. Today we're going to talk about drawing rhythms. Now this is not going to be a rhythm study as far as talking about the duration of rhythms and how that relates to time. Rather what I'm going to do is show you how to notate particular rhythms and go into some of the basic math of how the rhythms relate to one another, such as this particular type of note is going to equal X amount of these other types of notes. Not giving the notes a value themselves, but showing you how they relate to one another. And without further ado, we'll get started.
Rhythms tell us two things. They will tell us when to make sounds and when to have silence. And so part of drawing rhythms is making sure that we draw the symbols clearly to where the performer is going to interpret either the when to make a sound or when to not make a sound. They'll interpret that accurately. So we're going to begin with notes. Now, the first type of note I'm going to draw here, I'm going to draw it on the staff, is a whole note. Oh, let me change to a pen rather than an eraser. That might be more effective for us. So we have the whole note. Now I'm not going to get into the value of a whole note as far as how it relates to time. I'll touch a little bit on that in the fourth video. This video is strictly about how to draw them properly and showing a little bit of mathematical relation. Now, the whole note is just an open note head. You will not have a whole note that is just a closed note head. That's not going to happen. Whole note is an open note head. Now, we can take whatever we're calling the value of a whole note, we can cut that in half and create something called a half note. Now, the half note is an open note head with a stem. If you recall from the first video, I talked about stem length and how we usually make that be 3 spaces on the staff. I have it just a little short because I didn't want it to clash with the whole note there. So, as the name implies, you can whatever the value of a whole note is, half note is half of that value. And so, for the space that a whole note would take up, you could have 2 half notes in that space of a whole note. Continuing on, if we were to take this half note and color in the note head, we now have a quarter note. And you can figure out the mathematical relation there. You can have 2 quarter notes in a half note, and then you could have 2 half notes in a whole note. Now, continuing on, we take this quarter note that has the closed note head and a stem, and we can add a flag to it. Adding this flag is going to cut the value of the whole note in half into now an eighth note. And just as this pattern goes, 2 eighth notes would be worth, that's a pretty terrible curve there, the same as a quarter note, which 2 quarter notes will be worth a half note and 2 half notes will be worth a whole note. So, moving on. If we were to take the eighth note, and we add a second flag to it, we now have a 16th note. And then this pattern continues. 2 16th notes equal an eighth note, 2 eighth notes equal a quarter note, 2 quarter notes equal a half note, 2 half notes equal a whole note. Now again, I'm not talking about the value as far as saying whole note is worth something and then you figure out what all the other notes are worth. I'm simply talking about the relation between the notes themselves. And there's 2 more that we're going to go over. We have the 32nd note, which you can probably figure out the pattern now. We have 3 flags to make the 32nd note. not 30 seconds as in it lasts for 30 seconds, but it is worth a 32nd of a whole note. And then lastly, you have the 64th note, which is going to have 4 flags on it. Which 2 of those would be worth 1 32nd note, which 2 of those would be worth 1 16th note, 2 of those are worth an 8th note, 2 of those are worth a quarter note, 2 of those are worth a half note, and 2 of those would be worth a whole note. So it is possible to keep going. We could have 5 flags and call it a 128th note. But in my experience, rarely will you see more than 4 flags on a note. And it all begins with the open note head, and then we keep modifying it all the way until we get 4 flags or beyond. So the same idea applies with notes that are going to have the stems pointing up. I'm going to, actually I'll just clear the page here and give you examples of stem up notes for that. The whole note is not going to matter because the whole note is simply a note head. The half note, if I were to have the, I was saying stem up, I meant stem down, then the stem's going to be, as I mentioned in the first video, on the left-hand side of the note. The quarter note will follow suit. The 8th note, notice the flag is on the right-hand side of the stem. The 16th note, and I tend to draw my lower flag, or in this case, the higher of the flags first. 32nd note and 64th note. Now, if you were to look at professionally engraved music, you're going to see more finesse to how we draw the flags. I simply don't have the skill to do that, but the point of this is to show you that what the flags mean as far as continuing to cut the value, the perceived value of a note in half. Now, as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, you have notes and rests. The notes are telling our performers when to make sounds, and then the position on the staff, as I mentioned in the last video, tell them what sounds to make, whatever letter sounds. A rest, however, tells us when to have silence. So, for a rest, we will start with the whole rest. And the whole rest sits on the 4th line of a staff, no matter what the clef is. 4th line of the staff. And there you go, the whole rest. The half rest sits on the 3rd line of the staff. And I used to teach my students and help them remember, the half rest looks like a hat. The quarter rest is kind of a strange thing. I'm going to do the best I can to draw it. When I write it, my performers typically know what I'm trying to do. But again, if you look at professionally engraved music, you'll see some more detail to it. But we have the quarter rest. Unlike the notes, it's not as clear of a pattern of you have open note head, stem, closed note head and stem, on and on and on. Rests are a little bit different. Then we get into the 8th rest. And what I used to teach my students is the 8th rest is a 7 with a big nose on it. So if that helps you remember, by all means. Now, at this point, we do get into a pattern. A 16th rest will have 2 of kind of like flags, as we had with the 16th note. And the 32nd rest and then oops, let me try that again. And the 64th rest. Now, notice that the overall length of the stem of this rest, for lack of a better phrase, is lengthening as we move from 16th to 32nd to 64th. That way, we're not trying to cram all these little flags together in one small space. But with the 8th rest, 16th, and 32nd rest, you see the symbol pattern. Whole rest, half rest, quarter rest, not so much. These have the same relationship as the notes have. So 2 64th rests would be the same as 1 32nd rest. 2 32nd rests would be the same as a 16th rest. 2 16th rests the same as an 8th rest. 2 8th rests would equal a quarter rest. 2 quarter rests equals a half rest. And then 2 half rests equal a whole rest. Now, the next thing we're going to get into is combining notes and rests. And what I mean by that, rests are pretty simple. There really isn't much notation for combining rest. If you were to draw a measure, I'm going to clear our page here. If we were to draw a measure, and getting a little ahead of myself, I'm going to explain measures in more detail in the next video, but just for the sake of argument, let's say the space between these two vertical lines here is a measure. And in this measure, let's say we wanted to draw 4 quarter rests. We would draw, that last one wasn't that good. Let me try the last one again. There we go. We would draw 4 separate rests. We don't have any kind of special notation with that. Likewise with the other rests. If I were to draw another line, which we'll call a bar line as of the next video, and I draw some 8th rests, it's the same idea. We're not going to have any special symbol combining them. They're just going to be individual symbols. Now, one shorthand that you will see is, let's say that there was a music that had multiples of these measures. So each of these is a measure. And we wanted to have the performer rest during that whole span of time. Sometimes what composers will do, rather than draw 3 different measures with rest, what they'll do is this symbol here. It's kind of like drawing a measure, and this sort of looks like the whole and half rest as far as the dark lines, but they'll draw the symbol and put a number over it, and that tells you the number of measures that you're going to be silent. You'll be producing silence. Again, I'm going to go into what a measure is in a little more detail in the next video, but I wanted to go ahead and expose you to this notation here as far as combining whole measures of rest. But individual rests we don't do much combination for. That is different for notes. Let me clear the page once again. And we're going to start with the 8th note. So it is perfectly acceptable to draw what I'm drawing here. 4 single 8th notes. They have the filled-in note head, they have the stem, and they have the single flag. And often in vocal music, you will see single 8th notes because it tends to be a little bit easier to read the rhythms and read the lyrics at the same time as single 8th notes, so you'll often see this in vocal music. Now, it's not unheard of in instrumental music, nor is what I'm about to draw unheard of in vocal music. You just tend to see the individual notes a little bit more. Now, another way I can draw these 8th notes is like this. Now, notice we still have the filled-in note head. We still have the stem, right? But what we have done, we have traded the flags for beam. So rather than one flag on the notes, we use one beam to connect them together. So you might ask, well, these kind of look like quarter notes. They have the note head and stem, but having this beam, and notice how I drew the beam a little bit thicker than I would just the stem. Having that beam there tells us that they're actually 8th notes, and we've combined 4 together. This doesn't change the value of the 8th note. Every 2 8th notes is still equal to a quarter note, but visually it can be a little bit easier to read the beamed together notes versus the individual notes. Now that contradicts what I just said about a lot of vocal music and lyrics, but again, the whole goal of notation is to be as clear as possible so that way the performer can interpret what we're writing the best possible way. And at times it will be much clearer to beam together eighth notes. Other times it won't be, so we don't beam them together. Now, one of the reasons why we have this beam is, let's say that you had, we'll draw a fifth line note here. And let's say that you cheated the stems just a bit, and you didn't get that full three spaces worth of stems. Now, right here, let's say rather than having this kind of light blue background, the staff paper was black. Well, now I have a real thin beam connecting these notes, and the question becomes, are they quarter notes or are they eighth notes? It might be difficult to tell. So with the beams, we usually draw beams a little bit thicker, so it'll be very clear that no, in fact, that is not just quarter notes that are touching a bar line. These are 4 eighth notes that are beamed together. Now, following the pattern of flags, let's say I were to draw 16th notes. So if I were to draw 4 separate 16th notes here, and if I were to draw them using a beam, I would have 2 beams, because that would be the same as having the 2 flags on the 16th notes. Likewise, if you were to draw 4 32nd notes, you would have 3 beams on those, and if you were to draw the 64th notes, you would have 4 beams on the 64th notes. Now you can see kind of an upward curve of my beams here. You would want to avoid this. Ideally with your writing, you're going to have the beams being perfectly parallel, since the note heads have not changed position on the staff. Therefore, there really shouldn't be an upward slant. That was just me being a little sloppy there. But the point being is the number of beams will always be equal to the number of flags of the individual notes. One other thing to go over are combining beamed notes and non-beamed notes. So let me clear the page again. You will sometimes see a pattern like this. Let's say you have an eighth note, actually this isn't combining beamed and non-beamed notes, this is combining 2 different beamed kind of notes together. This is a pretty common pattern that you'll see. Since we know relationship-wise 2 eighth notes equals a 16th note, this is going to be effectively worth 4 16th notes. And what I've done here, if you're reading this, you'll see 2 beams, so this note must be a 16th note. A single beam, this note must be an eighth note. And then 2 beams, you would have 16th note. Now, something that you're probably not going to see is this, and if you were to see it, I would complain to your engraver, because this is going to be quite confusing. You're not going to do this, because the question becomes, what is that note in the middle? I mean, it has a beam and it has a flag. Does that mean it's a 16th note? Or does that mean that the composer wants everything to kind of be beamed together and have an eighth note there? It's ambiguous. And again, the goal is to not be ambiguous with any kind of writing. So when you're making the choice whether or not to or not to beam notes together, you want to stay consistent. I would not do this, even though this is technically correct. I would probably not have this in a piece of music. I would choose to beam those 4 eighth notes together, or pick if I wanted them grouped, because visually it might be a little bit easier to group them in groups of 2. I would either beam 2 eighth notes together each time, or I would simply have all 4 as single eighth notes. Again, the goal being clarity. Now, I have not left out the whole note, the half note, and the quarter note, but These do not have any type of special beams for combining notes together. They're very much like the rest, and as far as if you were to have multiple whole notes, you're simply drawing multiple whole notes, or multiple half notes, multiple quarter notes, like that. You would not start beaming these together, because then you're going to confuse them with eighth notes and 16th notes as well.
So as you can imagine, there's a lot to rhythm, and we just barely scratched the surface of just notating it and how particular notes relate to one another, such as the whole note always being equal to 2 half notes, which that would also be equal to 4 quarter notes. We haven't talked about value yet as far as what the whole note means in terms of how much time it lasts, but understanding the relationships is pretty important itself. So I hope you found it useful. Make sure that you check out the final video where I talk about dividing the staff into measures, and that kind of ties everything together with the rhythms that we looked at in this particular video. If you enjoyed this, make sure you click like and subscribe to the channel so you'll be aware of when new content comes out, and we'll see you the next time.